It was one of those afternoons that seemed borrowed from an English summer postcard. The sky, a soft, unbroken blue, the hedgerows drowsy with bees, and the lawns of St. Mary Mead shining like polished emerald. Mrs. Bantry's garden, famous in the village for its manicured borders and scandalously modern fountain, was playing host to what she proudly called her first proper garden party since the war. By 3 o'clock, the guests were already arriving, women in light floral dresses and wide-brimmed hats, men perspiring politely under straw boaters. The tables, set beneath striped canopies, overflowed with sponge cakes, cucumber sandwiches, and jugs of homemade lemonade. The air was thick with chatter, gossip, and the faint perfume of roses. At a modest table near the end of the lawn sat Miss Jane Marple, knitting needles clicking quietly in her capable hands. She was dressed in a simple summer frock and a straw hat that had seen many seasons, yet her eyes, sharp and curious, missed nothing. "Such a lovely turnout," said Mrs. Bantry, bustling past with the brisk joy of a woman in her element. "Even the vicar's wife has come, though she swore she'd never forgive me for that business about the azaleas." Miss Marple smiled. "People are very forgiving when there's Victoria Sponge, dear." "Ha, you're right as ever," said Mrs. Bantry, then lowered her voice. "And would you believe it? Mrs. Harcourt's brought her new companion. The one she hired after her husband died. Some sort of nurse, I think, or a secretary. Can't quite tell." Miss Marple's needles paused. The widow Harcourt. My, that didn't take long. Indeed, across the garden stood Mrs. Evelyn Harcourt, the widow in question, a striking woman in her late 40s, still handsome in a pale, composed way. Dressed in black silk despite the heat, she held herself with the careful dignity of one who wishes to remind others of her grief, even when surrounded by laughter. At her side hovered a younger woman, slender, fair-haired, with an air of quiet watchfulness. Miss Lydia Price. Several guests were whispering about them already. Mrs. Harcourt had been widowed only 3 months earlier, after her husband, Colonel Geoffrey Harcourt, had been found dead in his study at the Gables. "Heart failure," the coroner had said. A respectable tragedy, neatly concluded, yet gossip, like ivy, had a way of clinging to every available wall in St. Mary Mead. "Between you and me," murmured Mrs. Price, the grocer's wife, to Miss Marple as she reached for a scone, "I don't believe for a moment it was natural, not with the way she's carrying on now. That black dress of hers is more Paris than mourning, if you ask me." Miss Marple, eyes still on her knitting, merely replied, "Grief takes many forms, my dear, sometimes even elegance." A burst of laughter rose from the croquet lawn, where young Mr. Arthur Liddon was trying and failing to impress the vicar's niece with his aim. The band from Much Benham played a hesitant waltz, and all seemed perfectly ordinary, the kind of gentle, sunlit day that would be remembered fondly in diaries and dull winters. Until, of course, it wasn't. It began with a scream, a short, sharp, unmistakably human cry, slicing through the chatter, halting the music mid-bar. Heads turned. Glasses were set down. Miss Marple's knitting dropped softly into her lap. The scream had come from the direction of the summer house, a charming ivy-covered structure at the far end of the garden, where Mrs. Harcourt had been seen only minutes before. Mrs. Bantry, flustered but determined, gathered her skirts and hurried forward. The crowd followed, a murmuring flock of curiosity and dread. Inside the summer house, sunlight filtered through lace curtains, illuminating a scene of dreadful stillness. Mrs. Harcourt lay collapsed upon the floor, one arm outstretched, her black silk dress torn at the shoulder. Beside her, on the small wicker table, stood an overturned teacup, Its contents spilled across a folded white napkin. Miss Lydia Price knelt beside her employer, trembling. She just fell, she gasped. I brought her tea as she asked. And then oh dear God, Dr. Haydock, who had been standing nearby discussing dahlias with the vicar, pushed through the onlookers and knelt to examine the body. After a long moment he frowned deeply. She's gone, he said quietly. Quite gone. Poor woman. Mrs. Bantry's hand flew to her mouth. But how? She was perfectly well an hour ago. The doctor examined the teacup, sniffed, and his brow furrowed further. We'll have to see what this was, he said grimly. Could be poison. Looks like almond. Good Lord. A murmur rippled through the gathering. Poison. The word carried a strange fascination, at once horrifying and oddly thrilling. The widow who had buried one husband now lay dead herself, struck down amid roses and cake stands. Miss Marple bent to retrieve her fallen knitting, her expression unreadable. Poison, she repeated softly. Such a feminine method. The local constable arrived within the hour, looking both bewildered and important. Statements were taken, guests ushered home, and by dusk, the cheerful garden had become a scene of hushed speculation and yellow cordons. Later that evening, in the quiet of her sitting room, Miss Marple sat by the window with a cup of cocoa, her mind turning over the day's events like pages of a familiar novel. A widow, a sudden death, a cup of tea. Heart failure, she murmured to herself, recalling Colonel Harcourt's untimely demise. And now poison. Curious symmetry, that. Outside, the church bells tolled 7, their sound drifting over the rooftops like a sigh. The village would buzz with gossip by morning, theories, suspicions, half-truths. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to listen too closely to the noise. People, she thought, revealed themselves most clearly, not in what they said, but in what they failed to hide. And as the last light faded over St. Mary Mead, she folded her knitting neatly beside her and whispered to the empty room, "Oh, my dear Mrs. Harcourt, I do wonder what you were so afraid of." By the following morning, St. Mary Mead was alive with rumor, the murder. For by breakfast, it had become a murder in everyone's telling, had fluttered through the village like a startled bird, touching every sitting room and shop counter. At the post office, Miss Hartnell insisted she had known something dreadful would happen to Mrs. Harcourt. There was always that look about her, she said meaningfully, as she handed over a stack of telegrams. You know, the sort of woman who's accustomed to secrets. It shows in the eyes. Mrs. Price, behind her, nodded eagerly, and such an odd thing to have a companion so soon after her husband's death. My Charlie said she was probably lonely, but I told him, lonely women don't usually hire beautiful young blondes to read them the paper. At the butcher's, meanwhile, Mr. Liddon declared with certainty that the tea must have been poisoned before it was brought to the summer house. Means the poor nurse, what's her name? Lydia? Couldn't have done it. She only carried it out, see? It must have been prepared beforehand, most likely by that housekeeper of hers. That old thing, Mrs. Rudge, said the butcher's assistant with relish, always looked at me as though I were slicing her cat. Wouldn't put it past her. And in the drawing rooms of the better homes, conversation took on a more refined, but no less speculative air. It's such a pity, sighed Mrs. Bantry to her husband over breakfast. I always said Evelyn Harcourt's life was far too quiet. First her husband dies suddenly, now she herself. It's like something out of one of those dreadful serials. I shouldn't be surprised if it turned out to be that companion. You know how these girls can get. Living in close quarters, seeing to everything, never any real life of their own. Colonel Bantry grunted over his bacon. Nonsense. Poison's not a servant's weapon. Takes planning, knowledge. If anyone did it, it's someone with a cool head, not a hysterical nurse. You mark my words, Dolly. In the high street, the blinds of the gables remained drawn. The constable had posted a notice forbidding entry, and only the occasional curious villager dared linger near the gates before scurrying off again. The summer house, too, was cordoned off, its cheerful ivy now lending it an air of mockery. Miss Marple, for her part, went about her morning in her usual calm fashion. She attended to her geraniums, fetched a letter from the post office, and smiled pleasantly at those who asked whether she had seen it happen. She offered no theories, only the mild observation that people are very strange creatures when they think they're unobserved. By noon, Inspector Craddock had arrived from Much Benham, a capable man, shrewd and rather weary-looking. He knew Miss Marple well enough to greet her with a respectful nod when he spotted her outside the bakery. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said. "You were there yesterday, I believe?" She inclined her head. "Purely by accident, Inspector. I find garden parties have a way of ending quite differently than they begin." He smiled faintly. "Yes, well, we've a puzzle on our hands. The doctor says it was cyanide, almost certainly in her tea. The question is, who had the opportunity to put it there?" "Opportunity," Miss Marple murmured, "is rarely the rarest thing in murder, Inspector. Motive, however, that's another matter." Craddock sighed. "I don't suppose you'd happen to have a theory already?" "Oh, dear me, no," she said, her eyes twinkling. "I've found theories are best left to the police. I only observe human nature, though," she added thoughtfully, there was a look on poor Mrs. Harcourt's face, as though she'd seen something, or someone, she hadn't expected. The inspector noted this down, though he did so with a skeptical air. Miss Marple's observations, as he called them, had a way of becoming inconveniently correct. That afternoon the inquest was formally announced. The village, always eager for an outing cloaked in moral gravity, buzzed with excitement. "I dare say half the women in St. Mary Mead will turn up in their Sunday best," said Mrs. Price with relish. "There's nothing we like better than seeing our neighbors questioned under oath." And indeed, when the inquest convened in the small hall by the church, it was standing room only. Mrs. Bantry sat near the front, fanning herself. The vicar's wife took notes. Even the schoolmistress, who rarely attended such things, was present, claiming it was educational. Miss Lydia Price was the first to give evidence. She looked pale, almost translucent under the harsh light, her voice soft but steady. "Mrs. Harcourt asked for tea just before 3. I fetched it from the table where the maids had set it out. She seemed perfectly normal, perhaps a little tired. I left her for 5 minutes, and when I returned, she was on the floor. The coroner inquired whether anyone else had touched the tea. Lydia shook her head. It was already poured when I took it. Mrs. Rudge, the housekeeper, testified next. Her eyes were red-rimmed but defiant. "I poured the tea myself, sir. Plain black, no sugar, same as always." Miss Price took the tray straight away. "I didn't see anyone else near it. Did Mrs. Harcourt have any enemies to your knowledge?" Mrs. Rudge hesitated. "Enemies? No, sir, not as such. But there were disagreements. Mr. Harcourt's will, for one. Some folk thought she was left too much." There was a murmur at this, swiftly hushed by the coroner. When the formalities concluded, Inspector Craddock stood. "We are continuing our inquiries," he said. "There will be further interviews. No conclusions have been drawn." Outside, as the villagers spilled into the sunshine, tongues wagged freely again. "The will," hissed Miss Hartnell. "Did you hear that? I knew it would come to money." "And yet," said Mrs. Price, eyes darting about, "why poison her now, months after the husband's death? Whoever did it must have had something new to lose." Miss Marple who had sat quietly through the proceedings, walked home with measured steps. She paused by the churchyard gate, glancing at the marble stone of Colonel Geoffrey Harcourt. Fresh flowers lay there, lilies, still damp from morning dew. How curious, she thought, such fresh devotion for a man gone 3 months. And lilies, not the sort of flower one chose idly. Someone wanted to make a point. That evening, as twilight deepened, Miss Marple sat knitting by her hearth. Her cat had dozed by the fire, and the only sound was the steady click of needles. She thought of Lydia Price's trembling hands, of Mrs. Rudge's defiance, of the coroner's phrase, "Enemies, not as such." Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was very much like her knitting, a tangle of threads, twisted this way and that, and yet, if one followed carefully, there was always a pattern, and somewhere in that pattern lay the truth. The next morning dawned gray and unsettled, a thin mist clinging to the thatched roofs of St. Mary Mead as though reluctant to leave. It was the sort of morning, Miss Marple thought, that encouraged introspection. She was out early, trimming her roses, when Inspector Craddock's motor car hummed past her gate on its way to the Gables. He raised a hand in brief greeting. She, in turn, gave a mild nod before returning to her secateurs. Across the village, blinds twitched. There was something oddly exhilarating about an official investigation taking place in their midst. A break from routine, a thrill of the forbidden. Everyone had a theory, no one had the truth, and yet, in the drawing room of the Gables, Inspector Craddock sat with his notebook open, determined to find it. Lydia Price, pale and drawn, sat opposite him. She had the air of a woman who had slept little and wept less. "You must understand, Inspector," she said quietly. Mrs. Harcourt was not well. She suffered from what Dr. Haydock called her nervous fancies. Often she believed someone was watching her, following her. I thought it a symptom of strain. Craddock studied her face, and did she ever mention who this someone might be? A pause. She said only that she had made enemies, that people resented her happiness after the Colonel's passing. Lydia looked down. It was absurd, of course. Mrs. Harcourt was not happy. She was lonely, frightened even. The inspector made a note. Did she receive any unusual letters or visitors recently? Letters, yes, Lydia said after a moment. She would lock them away in her desk. I never saw the handwriting, but she always grew agitated afterward. Once she told me she was being accused of something terrible, something from long ago. Craddock looked up sharply. Did she say what? No, only that people never forgive. When Lydia had gone, the inspector sat for a long moment, staring at the neat writing in his notebook. A woman accused, a sudden death, a companion too careful with her answers. It was all unpleasantly neat. He disliked neatness in murder. Later that day, Miss Marple was invited, or perhaps summoned, in that gentle way she had of being exactly where she was needed, to tea with Mrs. Bantry. Her hostess, half delighted and half scandalized, poured generously. "My dear Jane, it's positively dreadful. The whole village can talk of nothing else. Did you know the inspector's taken samples from the teacups? Imagine, from my best china." "Yes, dear," Miss Marple said mildly. "He's being very thorough, quite proper. I told him, of course, that I couldn't think who would wish Mrs. Harcourt harm. Though between us, Jane, I always felt there was something, well, theatrical about her grief. And poor Lydia Price, she looks as though she might collapse at any moment. Though some say that's guilt, not sorrow. People do enjoy finding guilt where they can," Miss Marple observed. "It makes them feel clever." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice. "Do you think she did it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Dolly, I think people rarely do exactly what we expect them to. especially when money or love are involved. At that moment, Colonel Bantry came in with the Daily Mail tucked under his arm. I see the coroner's ruling has stirred things up. Says here the police suspect someone close to the household. Well, they'll have to look no further than that companion, if you ask me. Poison's a woman's weapon. Miss Marple raised her brows. Oh, indeed. But women are not all the same sort of woman, Colonel. One must always ask, what kind? The Colonel grumbled into his tea, unconvinced. That afternoon, Inspector Craddock made his way to Miss Marple's cottage. It had become, over the years, a sort of ritual. His investigations often found themselves punctuated by tea with St. Mary Mead's most deceptively gentle resident. "I hope you won't think me forward, Miss Marple," he said as she showed him in, "but I should like your opinion, purely off the record." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Of course, Inspector. People always do." He consulted his notes. "We've confirmed cyanide, most likely administered in the tea. The poison wasn't in the pot. It must have been added to the cup. The only person who handled the cup, apart from the victim, was Miss Price." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "But opportunity is one thing, Inspector. Willingness is quite another." "Exactly," Craddock said. "That's why I'm not satisfied with the obvious answer. There's talk in the village that Mrs. Harcourt had enemies. Something about her late husband's will. He left her nearly everything, and apparently his niece expected rather more," said Miss Marple softly. "Miss Clara Harcourt. A very striking young woman, if I recall. Lives in London now, doesn't she? Something to do with the theater." "That's the one. She arrived last night, demanded to see me first thing. Claims her uncle's death wasn't natural either. Says her aunt had reason to keep him quiet." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. 2 sudden deaths in one household within 3 months. It does suggest a pattern, doesn't it? "It does," Craddock admitted grimly. "The trouble is, patterns are easy to imagine when you want them. What I need is something solid. Something to show this wasn't just coincidence." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Coincidences, Inspector, are like mushrooms in autumn, perfectly natural in small numbers. But if you find too many, it's best to suspect a toadstool." He chuckled despite himself. "Then I'll keep looking." When he had gone, Miss Marple remained seated, her expression distant. She thought of Lydia Price's composure, of Mrs. Harcourt's whispered fear of accusation, and of the curious symmetry of 2 deaths that appeared unrelated, yet seemed to echo one another. That evening, she took a slow walk through the village. The mist had lifted, revealing the soft gold of the setting sun over the fields. As she passed the gables, she paused at the gate. The garden was empty now, the summer house draped in police tape that fluttered in the breeze. On the gravel path near the door, something caught her eye, a small glinting object half buried in the dirt. She bent, brushing away a few leaves, and found a single silver thimble, dented and worn. Miss Marple turned it over in her hand, eyes narrowing. "A thimble," she murmured. "How curious. Not at all something one would expect at a tea table, unless the seamstress was working while she waited." She slipped it quietly into her pocket. The widow who sewed her own alibi, she thought suddenly. A curious phrase that drifted unbidden through her mind. Perhaps, she mused, Mrs. Harcourt had indeed been sewing something that day, but not fabric. Perhaps she had been stitching together a story, one thread at a time, in hopes that no one would notice where the seams failed to meet. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself, that small knowing smile that so often preceded revelation. Human nature, she reflected, was very like embroidery, lovely on the surface, but quite a tangle behind. And somewhere, tangled in that thread, was a truth someone had tried very hard to hide. The next 2 days brought both rain and restlessness to St. Mary Mead. The drizzle tapped softly at the windows while the talk inside every shop and sitting room grew louder and more assured. Nothing nourished speculation quite like a bit of bad weather. By Tuesday afternoon, there were two opinions firmly rooted in the village: that Miss Lydia Price had poisoned her employer, or that someone, probably a relative, had done so in revenge. The balance of gossip shifted hourly, depending on who had the more compelling whisper. At the post office, Miss Hartnell insisted the police were preparing to arrest Lydia. "It's obvious, isn't it?" she declared, stamping a letter with righteous satisfaction. Poison tea, a nervous young woman, and that ridiculous story about secret letters. Really, one might almost think she'd read too many detective novels. Mrs. Price, arranging a display of boiled sweets, sniffed. Or perhaps Mrs. Harcourt wasn't the saint everyone pretended she was. "I heard from my cousin, her husband's solicitor's clerk, mind you, that she came into quite a bit of money she wasn't meant to have. There's something queer about that will." Meanwhile, at the Gables, Inspector Craddock sat in the late colonel's study, its air still heavy with cigar smoke and faded masculinity. The fire crackled in the grate, though it was early autumn, and Lydia Price sat once again in the chair opposite him, hands folded tightly in her lap. "I've told you everything I know, Inspector," she said. I brought her tea. It was already poured. I never touched the cup after that. Craddock's voice was steady, not unkind. "You understand, Miss Price, it looks very bad for you. You were alone with her when she died. The servants were occupied elsewhere. The doctors confirmed cyanide could only have been added after the tea was poured." "I know," Lydia whispered. "But I didn't do it. I would never." "Did Mrs. Harcourt trust you?" "Yes, I think so." He watched her carefully. "Did she ever confide in you about her husband's death?" A long silence. Rain pattered against the window. Finally, she said, "She told me once that she had lied to the police, that she hadn't been in her room when he died. She said it was to avoid unpleasant talk." Lydia looked up suddenly, her voice trembling. "But she wasn't guilty of anything, Inspector. She was frightened, that's all." Craddock leaned back, tapping his pen against his notebook. "Frightened people sometimes do dangerous things, Miss Price, and frightened people are often the easiest to silence." When Lydia left the room, Craddock exhaled heavily. He didn't like the way her eyes lingered on the door, as though expecting someone to be waiting on the other side. Outside, Miss Marple walked slowly down the lane under her umbrella. She paused to exchange a few words with the milkman, then continued toward the Gables, where she had been invited, unofficially, of course, to take tea with Inspector Craddock and discuss his progress. "You do make things difficult for a man, Miss Marple," he said as she entered. "Every time I'm about to make an arrest, I can almost hear you clucking your tongue." She smiled benignly. "I find it very unwise to rush toward conclusions, Inspector. It gives the wrong person time to tidy up their work." He sighed, pouring her tea. "I wish I had your confidence. The facts are simple. She was poisoned. The poison wasn't in the pot. Only Lydia handled the cup. I'm a man who believes in arithmetic, Miss Marple. And two make 4. "Yes," she said mildly, "but they don't always make the right 4. Craddock frowned, bemused. "Meaning?" Miss Marple leaned forward, eyes bright. "Meaning that your arithmetic assumes the situation was as it appeared. But what if the tea wasn't the only thing served to Mrs. Harcourt that afternoon? What if she consumed something else? A small cake, a piece of fruit, before the fatal sip? You see, people forget such details because they appear unimportant." He blinked. "You think the poison could have been in the food?" "I think," said Miss Marple softly, "that whoever planned this knew we would all look at the cup." Craddock rubbed his temple. "You've a devious mind, Miss Marple. "Oh no," she smiled. "Merely an observant one. In my experience, murder is very rarely a matter of intellect. It's a matter of habit, of what people do without thinking." When she left, she stopped briefly at the gate to admire the late chrysanthemums. A small thing caught her eye, a black ribbon fluttering against a bush. She picked it up. It was from a lady's hat, neatly stitched but torn loose at one end. She tucked it into her reticule, her expression thoughtful. That evening the village hall buzzed again with new gossip. The return of Miss Clara Harcourt, the late colonel's niece. She had arrived in a hired car from London that afternoon, dressed in dark green and smelling faintly of expensive perfume. Her presence was instantly felt and instantly discussed. Such poise. Mrs. Bantry whispered to Miss Marple as they watched her enter the church the following morning. "But there's something hard about her, don't you think? Like a woman who's had to fight for everything." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "And who now means to collect what she believes she's owed." Clara Harcourt certainly wasted no time. By noon she had called upon Inspector Craddock, insisting on being heard. "My aunt killed my uncle," she said coolly, removing her gloves one finger at a time. "He was preparing to change his will. She discovered it. He died 2 days later. Conveniently, the new draft vanished." Craddock frowned. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Harcourt." "I make it deliberately," she replied. "And now, with her dead, I believe someone feared the truth might come out. Perhaps her companion knew too much. Or perhaps," Craddock said evenly, "you stand to gain if we believe that." She met his gaze without flinching. "Inspector, I don't need to gain. I need justice." When she had gone, Craddock looked down at his notes and muttered under his breath, "Justice always makes things untidy." Miss Marple, hearing the tale later from Mrs. Bantry, said nothing for a long moment. Then she observed, "Miss Harcourt strikes me as the sort of young woman who knows her way about the world, particularly the parts of it where sympathy can be useful. I do wonder whether she came down from London to help, or to remind everyone how wronged she's been." Mrs. Bantry looked startled. "You don't think—" Miss Marple's eyes were half closed. "I think, my dear Dolly, that when there are 2 deaths in one family, the living often show themselves in very revealing ways. That night, the rain stopped, and the moon rose pale and high above St. Mary Mead. At her window, Miss Marple laid the black ribbon beside the silver thimble she had found, one from a hat, the other from a sewing basket. Small, feminine things, but full of quiet meaning. She studied them for a long time, then whispered to herself, "People do like to tidy up after themselves, but sometimes they forget. Even the smallest stitch can unravel the whole garment." Below, the village slept, content with its theories and its gossip, but Miss Marple, eyes still sharp despite her years, knew that the pattern was only beginning to show, and somewhere in that pattern, she suspected, the wrong kind of woman had sewn her story a little too neatly. Morning broke over St. Mary Mead, with the kind of quiet brightness that often follows a night of unrest. The mist lifted lazily from the hedgerows, and the birds sang with an enthusiasm that felt almost irreverent, considering that the body of Mr. Harold Cooper had only been removed from his study a few hours earlier. Yet the village, being what it was, did not stand still for tragedy. The milk was delivered, the post arrived on time, and at the vicarage, Mrs. Clement was already gossiping to the maid about the dreadful business up at Hillcrest House. Miss Marple, sitting by her front window with her embroidery, appeared the picture of calm domesticity. The rhythmic movement of her needle through the linen betrayed none of the thoughts running quietly beneath the surface. She had been awake since dawn, pondering small inconsistencies, little things that most would never have noticed. But Miss Marple had made a lifelong study of the trivial, and she knew that truth often lurked in what others called coincidence. A knock at her door interrupted her reflections. It was Inspector Graves, looking more harassed than usual. His hat was slightly askew, and his notebook bulged with hastily written notes. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. "Hope I'm not disturbing you. I thought I might have a word." "Not at all, Inspector," she said pleasantly, setting aside her needlework. "I was just mending a tear in my tablecloth. Sit down. Do let me pour you some tea. You look as though you've been wrestling with something most unpleasant." Graves sighed. Lowering himself into the chair she indicated. "It's this business with Harold Cooper. Everything looks clear enough on paper. Shot in his study. No sign of forced entry. Revolver missing. But something's not sitting right with me." Miss Marple smiled gently. That's often the way of it. When something appears too tidy, it's usually been arranged so." He gave her a keen glance. "You've heard, I suppose, about the will?" "I dare say the village has heard before breakfast," she replied with mild amusement. Mr. Cooper's estate, going to his late brother's widow, Mrs. Lydia Cooper. A very generous arrangement, some might say, particularly since they were not, to my knowledge, on the warmest of terms. Graves nodded. "That's just it. We've taken her statement. Says she was at home all evening, mending a dress for the harvest ball. Her maid confirms it, but the timing's tricky. She claims she went to bed around 10, and the doctor puts death at roughly 9:30. Miss Marple murmured, stirring the tea slowly. "And the maid? Was she in the house all evening?" "Mostly, yes, except she says she stepped out to fetch some firewood from the shed for a few minutes around 9. "That's quite enough time," Miss Marple said softly, "to leave the house unnoticed, if one were so inclined." Graves frowned. "You think she might be lying?" "Oh, my dear Inspector, I think people very rarely tell the full truth, though not always out of malice. Sometimes it's convenience. Sometimes it's pride." He jotted something in his notebook. "We found a set of footprints by the garden gate at Hillcrest. Woman size, rather small. Could belong to Mrs. Cooper, but could just as easily be anyone else. The ground's damp from last night's rain." "Footprints are such indiscreet things," Miss Marple said. "They tell stories one would rather keep quiet." She sipped her tea. "Tell me, Inspector, was Mr. Cooper a man much liked in the village?" Graves gave a snort. "Liked? Not particularly. Respected, perhaps. He had a way of reminding people of their debts, financial or otherwise. Ran that timber business of his like a general commanding an army. But I can't say anyone will miss his temper." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "resentment is such a lingering poison. It can take years before it ripens into action." Graves leaned forward. "Do you think this was personal, then? A grudge?" "Most murders are, in one form or another," she said quietly. "Money and passion are simply disguises for wounded pride or fear." After the inspector left, Miss Marple sat for some time, gazing out over her neat little garden. Her eyes were distant, focused not on the flowers but on the small stitches of behavior that formed the tapestry of human life. She thought of Lydia Cooper, elegant, self-possessed, and now apparently a wealthy widow, and she thought of how calm she had seemed, far too calm, when speaking to the constable the previous night. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple decided on a little walk. Coincidentally, her path took her past Hillcrest House. A constable stood by the gate, but he recognized her and tipped his cap. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Mrs. Cooper's resting, but I expect she wouldn't mind you paying respects." "Oh, I wouldn't dream of disturbing her," Miss Marple said sweetly. "Just admiring the roses. Such a pity about poor Mr. Cooper. He was very proud of them, I recall." As she spoke, her eyes moved with quiet precision over the gravel drive, the freshly polished brass knocker, and the faint smear of mud just below the porch, as though someone had hastily wiped a shoe. She noted, too, that the flower beds near the side gate were unevenly pressed down, as if by a hurried step. When she turned back toward the village, Miss Marple's mind was whirring. There was something here, a small, overlooked detail, something that connected Mrs. Cooper's calm demeanor with the faintly muddied porch and the uneven footprints, a hidden stitch in the pattern. That evening, as the lamps were lit across St. Mary Mead, she sat by her fire and opened her sewing basket. From within, she drew out a scrap of muslin she had found years ago while visiting a friend, embroidered with a crooked line that had always bothered her. It reminded her that imperfection, once seen, could never be unseen. She threaded her needle with deliberate care. A woman who sews her own alibi, she murmured to herself, would know that one must always tidy the edges. But sometimes one stitch tells the whole tale. And with that, Miss Marple smiled faintly to the firelight, as if she had seen the faint outline of the truth beginning to emerge. Still hidden, but inevitable, the next day would bring new revelations, more gossip, and another unexpected twist in the tale of the widow who sewed her own alibi. The following morning, St. Mary Mead was abuzz with speculation. News had traveled faster than the milk float. Mrs. Lydia Cooper, it seemed, had taken ill. Mrs. Price, the grocer's wife, had told Mrs. Bantry that the widow had looked ghastly pale when she'd stopped by for a loaf of bread, and that she'd dropped her change twice before leaving in a hurry. By noon, the story had grown into something far more dramatic, that Mrs. Cooper had fainted dead away in the middle of the shop, and that the vicar's wife had been called to administer smelling salts. Miss Marple, of course, heard the various versions while enjoying her morning tea with Mrs. Bantry. The two ladies sat near the window overlooking the high street, pretending to be engrossed in their knitting while keeping a perfectly unobstructed view of the passing villagers. "Poor Lydia," Mrs. Bantry said with her usual relish for misfortune. "I do believe she's never been quite right since that dreadful business. But between you and me, Jane, she's rather too calm for a woman whose husband's just been murdered." Miss Marple made a small, thoughtful noise, the kind that could mean anything or nothing at all. "Some people, Dolly, deal with grief in curious ways. There are those who weep, and those who busy themselves with sewing." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Sewing? Mrs. Cooper mentioned, did she not, that she was mending a dress the night of the murder. Such domestic occupations can be very convenient. They keep one's hands busy, and perhaps one's conscience, too." Before Mrs. Bantry could inquire further, a knock came at the door. It was Inspector Graves again, looking harried and more than a little out of sorts. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat, "I wonder if I might trouble you for a few minutes." Mrs. Bantry, never one to miss a chance for intrigue, excused herself only after promising to pop in later to hear everything. Graves settled into the same chair he had used 2 days earlier, balancing his notebook on his knee. "We've run into a spot of bother," he began. "Seems Mr. Cooper had been planning to change his will. New papers drawn up, but never signed. The solicitor, Mr. Redfern, says the changes would have cut Mrs. Cooper's share down to almost nothing." "Ah," said Miss Marple quietly, "a most dangerous piece of information to learn, if one were the intended beneficiary." "That's what I thought," said Graves. "But there's something else. We found the missing revolver. It had been tossed into the duck pond behind the house. Muddy, of course, but the serial number matches." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "The duck pond? How curious. I should think that's rather an impulsive choice for a woman as composed as Mrs. Cooper. Indeed. Trouble is, there are no fingerprints left worth taking. But we did find something else. A scrap of green silk tangled on a bramble near the pond. Looks like it was torn from a dress. Miss Marple's eyes flickered, though her expression remained serene. And Mrs. Cooper was sewing a green evening gown that very night, was she not? Graves nodded grimly. Exactly. The maid says it was hanging in the wardrobe when she checked. Spotless. But she could be lying, or frightened. Miss Marple poured tea into 2 cups and passed one to him. Fear is a strange motivator, Inspector. People may say or do the most extraordinary things when they feel it breathing down their necks. Graves sipped his tea and sighed. To make matters worse, young Peter Braithwaite's gone missing since last night. He was seen near the Cooper place not long before dusk. Peter Braithwaite, Miss Marple murmured. The gardener's son, was he not? Rather fond of Mrs. Cooper's maid, if I recall correctly. That's him. Bit of a wild one. We'll find him, I'm sure, but his timing's suspicious. Miss Marple looked into her teacup. People who run away often do so not because they are guilty, but because they believe no one will believe their innocence. After the inspector left, Miss Marple sat in silence for a long while. Then she rose, took her shawl, and walked into the crisp autumn air. The road to Hillcrest House was quiet, save for the distant hum of bees and the crunch of leaves beneath her feet. At the gate, she found the maid, Elsie, gathering fallen apples into a basket. The young woman started at Miss Marple's approach. "Oh, good afternoon, ma'am. I didn't see you there." "No need to be nervous, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "Such a dreadful time for you, I'm sure. You must be quite exhausted." Elsie hesitated. "It's been awful, miss. Poor Mr. Cooper, and now Madam so pale and quiet. Though she keeps saying we mustn't dwell on it, but I can't sleep. Every time I shut my eyes, I see that study door." "You were very loyal to your mistress that evening," Miss Marple said softly. "Fetching wood, was it? Such a kind thought." Elsie's hands trembled slightly as she picked up an apple. "Yes, ma'am. The fire was nearly out, and she said she'd catch a chill without it. I was only gone a minute or 2. "Of course," Miss Marple said. "Tell me, did your mistress ever go out after you returned?" Elsie looked away. "She said she was going upstairs to change. I didn't see her again till morning." Murmured Miss Marple. "And the green dress she was mending, did she finish it that night?" Elsie hesitated. "She said she'd torn a seam by accident, and she'd fix it later. But when I looked next morning, it was perfect. Not a tear in sight." Miss Marple smiled gently. "What a clever needlewoman your mistress must be." As she walked home, Miss Marple's mind drew its quiet conclusions. A torn seam that no longer existed, a scrap of silk by the pond, footprints near the garden gate, and a conveniently calm widow. The pattern was stitching itself together in her mind, delicate, almost invisible, but unmistakable to one who knew how to read the threads of deceit. That evening, she wrote a brief note and sent it by young Tommy Briggs, who was always eager to earn a 6pence. It was addressed to Inspector Graves and contained just one sentence. "If you wish to understand the truth, bring Mrs. Cooper to tea at my cottage tomorrow at 4 o'clock, and do not mention the green silk." Then Miss Marple folded the note with care, smiled to herself, and began to set out her best china. Somehow, she suspected it would be a very revealing afternoon indeed. The following afternoon was bright and still, the kind of deceptive calm that often came before a storm, social or otherwise. Miss Marple's cottage smelled faintly of lavender polish and freshly baked seed cake, her tea service gleaming under the soft light of her sitting-room window. Every detail had been arranged with quiet precision. The lace doilies laid just so. The teapot warmed, the fire burning low and steady. At precisely 4 o'clock, the sound of a motor car broke the hush of the village lane. A minute later, Inspector Graves stepped inside, removing his hat and murmuring, "She's coming up the path now." "Excellent," Miss Marple said calmly. "Do sit, Inspector. I find one learns the most when one listens quietly." He gave her a quizzical look, but obeyed, settling himself discreetly behind the teapot as Miss Marple took her customary seat by the window. A few moments later, Mrs. Lydia Cooper was shown in. She was dressed impeccably, as always, an elegant navy dress, a pearl brooch at her throat, her hair arranged with careful precision. Only the faint pallor of her face betrayed her strain. "Miss Marple," she said with a small, practiced smile, "how very kind of you to invite me. I'm quite overwhelmed with everyone's sympathy, though I do wish they'd stop treating me as though I were made of glass." "My dear," Miss Marple said, rising to greet her, "we all cope in our own ways, and tea, I find, helps more than anything. Do sit down. I hope you don't mind that Inspector Graves has joined us. He happened to call, and I insisted he stay." Lydia's smile faltered only for a fraction of a second before she inclined her head. "Of course not. The inspector has been most understanding." They exchanged the usual pleasantries as Miss Marple poured the tea, milk first, 1 lump of sugar for the widow, none for herself. The conversation flowed smoothly, with Miss Marple's soft voice guiding it away from danger like a careful helmsman. But after the second cup, she began to steer ever so slightly toward the matter at hand. "You must find the house dreadfully lonely now," she said gently. "Hillcrest always seemed so full of sound when Mr. Cooper was alive." Lydia's fingers tightened on her teacup. "Yes, well, Harold was never one for silence. I suppose he was a man of strong opinions," Miss Marple said, her eyes mild. "Men of that sort often make enemies without realizing it. They can be very decisive about their wills, for instance." Lydia froze, just for a second. It was slight, a faint tightening at the corner of her mouth. But Miss Marple noticed it as surely as if the woman had shouted aloud. "I was quite unaware of any change," Lydia said smoothly. "The will you refer to was made years ago. I assume it remains valid." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "Such things are best left in writing, after all. Words spoken in anger can so easily be forgotten, or forgiven." Inspector Graves glanced at Miss Marple, wondering where she was going with this, but she only smiled serenely and offered more cake. As Lydia reached for a slice, Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice light and conversational. "You know, I was thinking about your dress, the green one you were mending that evening. Such a lovely color. I dare say it would have looked quite striking under moonlight." There was a pause. Graves, as instructed, said nothing. Lydia blinked once, then again. "Why, Miss Marple, what a curious remark. I was at home all evening." "You know that." Of course, Miss Marple said, nodding. "I only mentioned it because Inspector Graves found a scrap of green silk caught on a bramble by the duck pond." For a heartbeat, the room was utterly still. The clock ticked once, twice. Lydia's smile stiffened, her hand frozen midway to her teacup. "How extraordinary," she managed. "It must belong to someone else." "Quite possibly," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "Although I do recall, when I last visited Hillcrest, that you had a fondness for walking in the garden. It's a lovely place, though perhaps not ideal for silk gowns on damp evenings." The widow's hand trembled as she set down her cup. "Miss Marple," she said with icy politeness, "I'm not sure what you're implying." "Implying?" Miss Marple echoed softly. "My dear Mrs. Cooper, I imply nothing. I only observe. One observes that a revolver was thrown into the pond. One observes, too, that a woman who spends her evenings sewing might have a ready excuse for a small tear in her dress, an excuse that could later be mended away with skillful hands. It reminds me of poor Mrs. Phelps, who once tried to cover a burn mark in her tablecloth. A perfect patch, but alas, the scorch beneath remained. Lydia rose abruptly, her composure faltering. "I think I should go. I don't see why I should sit here being—" But Miss Marple's voice, though still gentle, cut across hers with quiet authority. "There's one other thing, Mrs. Cooper. Your maid said she left to fetch firewood. Just a few minutes, wasn't it? Quite enough time for someone else to slip out unseen. And when she returned, you said you were going upstairs. Only there's a patch of damp soil by your back door, where the grass was pressed down, recently, and by a woman's shoe. I happened to notice it on my walk yesterday." Lydia's eyes darted toward the inspector, then back to Miss Marple. Her lips parted, but no words came. "The trouble with deceit," Miss Marple went on softly, "is that one must keep stitching at it forever to keep it from unraveling. But the truth, my dear, is rather like a dropped thread. It finds its way to light, no matter how one tries to hide it." For a long moment, Lydia stood motionless. Then her shoulders sagged, and she sank slowly back into her chair. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "I only wanted to frighten him. He'd threatened to leave me penniless after everything I'd done for him. I thought if I fired near him, he'd see sense. But the gun went off, her voice broke, and then I panicked. I went to the pond and threw it in. I came back, sewed the tear, and waited. I thought, if I looked calm enough, they'd never suspect." Inspector Graves straightened, his face grim but not unkind. "Mrs. Cooper, I'll have to take a full statement." Lydia pressed her hand to her mouth, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. "He was cruel, Inspector, but I never meant to kill him." Miss Marple, still seated, regarded her with quiet sadness. "Intent is a very fragile thing, my dear. It can change in the space of a heartbeat. And yet the consequences remain, no matter how neatly one sews the seams." Outside, the church bells began to chime the hour. As Lydia Cooper was led from the cottage, Miss Marple poured another cup of tea for the inspector. "It's always the same, you know," she said softly. "People imagine murder to be a great drama, but it's really quite domestic, born of tempers, disappointments, and the tiniest misjudgments. A thread pulled too hard, and everything unravels." Inspector Graves nodded slowly. "You were right again, Miss Marple. You always are." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her gaze drifting to the garden beyond the window. "Oh, I don't know about that, Inspector. I simply pay attention. People are so like embroidery. You only need to look closely to see where the pattern goes wrong." And with that, she took a quiet sip of her tea, as the last echoes of the bell faded over the rooftops of St. Mary Mead. 2 days after Mrs. Lydia Cooper's tearful confession, the village of St. Mary Mead began, as villages do, to return to its tranquil rhythms. The postman whistled again on his rounds. The butcher's boy resumed his friendly flirtations with the grocer's assistant, and the church bell tolled softly on the hour. Life, as Miss Marple knew so well, had a remarkable way of mending itself, though the repaired fabric was never quite the same as before. Yet for all the calm that returned to its streets, St. Mary Mead was alive with whispers. Some said Lydia had been led astray by grief. Others whispered she'd been a calculating woman all along. Mrs. Price, who claimed to have known something was off from the start, now held court at the bakery, declaring that she'd always suspected those immaculate nails hid something dark beneath. Mrs. Bantry, meanwhile, took a more romantic view, that it had all been a crime of passion, and that poor Lydia had only done what desperation demanded. Miss Marple, however, said very little. She neither condemned nor defended. She merely listened and, as she often did, remembered. That afternoon, Inspector Graves came by once more. He found Miss Marple in her garden, trimming the rose bushes with careful precision. The air smelled faintly of autumn, sharp with the scent of fallen leaves. "Well, it's all wrapped up now," he said, leaning on the gate. "Mrs. Cooper's given a full confession. The coroner's satisfied. Solicitor says the will's to be voided. Most of it will go to charity now. Can't say there'll be much left for her once the law's through." Miss Marple clipped another rose, its petals the color of old wine. "Justice, I think, must sometimes be a sad business, Inspector. No one really wins." Graves nodded. "Aye, but the village can sleep easy again. No more secrets lurking behind lace curtains." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, my dear Inspector, villages never sleep easy. They only grow quiet for a while. Secrets, you see, are like dandelions. Cut one down, and two more sprout in its place." He chuckled. "You've a way of seeing through people, Miss Marple. Sometimes I think you'd have done better in my line of work." "Oh, I should hate it," she said cheerfully. "So many unpleasant details. I prefer the garden. One learns so much about people from flowers." Graves raised an eyebrow. "Flowers?" "Indeed," she said. "They thrive best in the right soil. Some grow wild and hardy, others require constant tending. But if one neglects them, or forces them into a place they don't belong, they wither, or worse, choke the others. Murder, Inspector, often grows the same way." The inspector looked at her for a long moment, then tipped his hat. "I'll remember that. Good day to you, Miss Marple." When he had gone, Miss Marple remained in her garden, her pruning shears idle in her hand. Her mind wandered, not to Lydia Cooper's guilt, but to the quieter tragedy beneath it. There had been fear in that woman's confession, yes, but also something else. Humiliation. Harold Cooper had, by all accounts, ruled his household like a small empire. His cruelty had been subtle, private, and constant. The kind of torment no court would ever record. It was not justice that pleased Miss Marple. It was understanding, and understanding, she knew, rarely came without sorrow. Later that evening she walked into the village for a few errands. The air was crisp, and the street lamps flickered with their golden glow. As she passed the post office, she heard Mrs. Bantry's familiar voice calling, "Jane! Jane, do wait a moment." Mrs. Bantry bustled up, cheeks pink with excitement. "You'll never believe it, my dear. Lydia's sister arrived this morning. Came straight from Bath. Poor thing looked positively stricken. I hear she's arranging to have Lydia moved to a sanatorium rather than a proper prison. Says her nerves have quite given way." Miss Marple nodded gently. "That would be a kindness. I dare say the poor woman has punished herself far more thoroughly than the courts ever could." Mrs. Bantry sighed. "You're always so understanding, Jane. I don't know how you do it. I should be furious with her, but when you speak of her, I almost pity the creature." Miss Marple gave a soft laugh. "We all might do dreadful things given the right pain. I've learned never to say, 'I would never,' but rather, 'I hope I should not.' It makes life much easier to forgive." Mrs. Bantry blinked at that, unsure whether to agree or not, and instead busied herself adjusting her gloves. "You are a wonder, Jane. Well, I must run. Colonel Bantry's waiting for his supper, and he gets frightfully cross if it's late." When Miss Marple returned home, dusk had fallen fully. The little cottage glowed warm against the darkening sky. She set her parcels down, lit the lamp, and made herself a quiet supper. On the table beside her lay a small scrap of green silk, the one Inspector Graves had found by the pond. He had given it to her earlier that day, saying with a wry smile, "A keepsake for the case you solved." Miss Marple had taken it without comment, but now, as she held it up to the lamplight, she could see how fine the stitching was along its edge. Smooth, deliberate, almost invisible, the work of steady practiced hands. She placed it gently beside her sewing basket and murmured to herself, "So much care to mend what cannot truly be mended." Her thoughts drifted to the countless women she had known in her life. The quiet wives, the patient mothers, the dutiful companions who bore small cruelties in silence. They, too, had learned to sew their pain neatly, to patch the tears life made in them. Some succeeded, others, like Lydia, stitched themselves into their own undoing. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9. Miss Marple rose, tidied away her supper things, and sat by the fire with her knitting. The flames cast soft shadows across the room, and she thought, not for the first time, how very much the world depended on small, unnoticed acts, both good and wicked. Her needles clicked steadily as the night deepened. Beyond the window the village lay still, wrapped once again in its illusion of peace. Yet Miss Marple knew the truth, as she always did, that beneath every quiet surface ran the tangled threads of human folly, love, fear, and pride. She looked toward the hearth, where the scrap of silk now lay folded. People, she whispered softly, are so much like fabric. They fray under strain, fade with neglect, and tear when stretched too thin. And when they try to mend themselves, that's when one sees the truth of their nature. A log cracked in the fire, scattering sparks up the chimney. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting hands never slowing. The mystery of Hillcrest House was closed, the case concluded. But in her quiet heart, she carried the same solemn understanding that had guided her through all the tragedies she had ever witnessed, that evil in its purest form was seldom monstrous. It was domestic, familiar, woven from the same cloth as kindness, only turned inside out. As the clock struck 10, Miss Marple set down her knitting, extinguished the lamp, and whispered her good night to the silent room. Outside, the stars shone cold and distant, and the little village of St. Mary Mead slept beneath them, peaceful once more, at least for now. In the week that followed, peace settled upon St. Mary Mead like a soft shawl laid across weary shoulders. The newspapers had moved on to fresher scandals. The gossip at the bakery dulled to repetition, and the Cooper affair was fast becoming a tale of poor souls and dreadful luck, rather than a living wound in the village's heart. But Miss Marple, ever observant, knew that peace was a fragile thing, a mirage more than a truth. Even now she saw its fractures, a lowered voice here, a hesitant glance there. The faint unease that lingers after wickedness has walked one's doorstep. It was a Wednesday afternoon when she noticed the first ripple in the calm. She had gone to the churchyard to tend to her parents' graves, a duty she performed with quiet devotion. The air was still, and the autumn sun shone weakly through a gauze of clouds. As she arranged a small bunch of chrysanthemums, she heard the faint crunch of footsteps on the gravel path behind her. "Miss Marple," came a voice, soft, uncertain, female. She turned to see a young woman standing there. Her face was pale beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and her hands twisted a handkerchief nervously. "Mrs. Lydia Cooper's sister, I believe?" Miss Marple said gently. The woman nodded. "Yes, Margaret Phelps. You're quite right." Miss Marple regarded her with kind eyes. "You must be having a difficult time of it, my dear." Margaret's lips trembled. "I can scarcely make sense of it, Miss Marple. Lydia was always so composed, so proud. I keep asking myself, how could she?" Miss Marple laid down her gloves on the gravestone. "People are rarely as composed as they seem, Miss Phelps. Pain has a way of wearing masks until it no longer can." Margaret lowered her head. "They said she killed him in anger, that he had threatened her again. But there's something that doesn't feel right. Lydia wasn't angry, not that night. She was frightened." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Frightened?" "Yes," Margaret said, her fingers tightening around her handkerchief. I spoke to her 3 days before it happened. She told me she thought someone was watching her, following her when she went to the shops. She even mentioned strange letters. Anonymous ones? A cool wind stirred the leaves. Miss Marple's mind began to weave threads together. Did she say who she suspected? Margaret shook her head. No one in particular, but she sounded trapped, as though she'd uncovered something she wasn't meant to. Miss Marple was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was low. Inspector Graves found no letters among her things. Are you certain she received them? I am, Margaret said firmly. She showed me one. Just a few words, but chilling. You think you're safe, but the truth isn't buried yet. I told her to take it to the police, but she burned it instead. The words settled in Miss Marple's heart, like a stone dropped into still water. So, the story was not quite as neatly tied as it seemed. Lydia Cooper had confessed, yes, but fear, real fear, had preceded the act. Thank you, my dear, Miss Marple said at last. You've been most helpful. Would you allow me to call upon you later this evening? There are questions one ought not to ignore. Margaret agreed, and Miss Marple made her way home through the narrow lanes, her mind alive with uneasy thoughts. The confession, the silk scrap, the missing letters, all began to align into something darker, subtler. That evening, when twilight folded itself around the village, Miss Marple visited the vicarage. Reverend Leonard Clement was reading by the fire, his wife Griselda knitting beside him. My dear Jane, said the vicar, looking up with a smile. We've not seen you since the inquest. You look troubled. Do sit down. Miss Marple did so, clasping her hands primly in her lap. It's about Mrs. Cooper, she said quietly. There may be more to her story than we knew. Griselda frowned. More? I thought she'd confessed everything. So she did, Miss Marple replied, but people sometimes confess to what they think they must, rather than what truly is. Guilt can take curious shapes. She explained what Margaret had told her. The letters, the fear, the sense of being watched. The vicar leaned forward. Good heavens, if that's true, then perhaps Harold Cooper's death wasn't as straightforward as we all thought. Miss Marple gave a faint nod. Indeed, it's possible Lydia was driven not merely by anger, but by terror, or worse, manipulation. Griselda laid down her knitting. You think someone else might have been involved? Perhaps, Miss Marple said softly, or perhaps someone wished her to think so. Fear, after all, is a most convenient tool. Reverend Clement sighed deeply. My dear Jane, you do make one question the very foundation of our peace. She smiled thinly. Peace, Leonard, is only the space between deceptions. Later, as she walked home under the pale glow of the moon, her thoughts returned to Lydia's garden. The pond, the roses, the half-finished embroidery still on the parlor table. The stitches had been so fine, so deliberate, and yet one line had been crooked. A single thread pulled too tightly, warping the design. That crooked stitch returned to her mind now, as metaphor and memory intertwined. Lydia's confession had been that stitch, neat on the surface, flawed beneath. When she reached her cottage, Miss Marple went straight to her writing desk. From the small drawer where she kept odd mementos, she drew out the green scrap of silk once more. Turning it over in the lamplight, she saw, faint but unmistakable, a trace of dark thread along its edge. Not green, not part of the original fabric. Almost black. Her eyes narrowed. How curious. If the scrap had come from Lydia's gown, then who had repaired it? And why with such a thread? She fetched her magnifying glass and examined the stitch. It was careful, practiced, but made by a hand that knew too well how to disguise flaws. A memory rose, unbidden. The village seamstress, Mrs. Finch, a brisk little woman with sharp eyes and sharper gossip. She had once worked for the Coopers, had she not? Altering dresses, repairing curtains, mending hems. Miss Marple set the silk down slowly, her mind crystallizing into quiet certainty. If Lydia had been frightened, if someone had sent her those letters, and if someone had tampered with her clothing, then perhaps the truth had yet to be fully stitched together. She stood by the window, looking out upon the sleeping village. The roofs lay silver beneath the moonlight, and in the hush of night, the faint hoot of an owl echoed through the fields. There were still secrets here, threads not yet tied, whispers not yet silenced. Miss Marple's expression softened into something both resolute and mournful. "It seems," she murmured, "the tapestry is not finished after all." She drew the curtains, extinguished the lamp, and retired for the night. But long after she lay in bed, her thoughts wove restlessly over silk and letters, fear and deceit, and the strange enduring truth that in St. Mary Mead, even the quietest stories had echoes beneath the calm. The following morning dawned gray and unsettled, the kind of day when clouds hung low enough to graze the chimneys of St. Mary Mead, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth. Miss Marple, however, was awake before sunrise, her mind sharper than the chill that lingered in her cottage. She took her tea in silence, eyes fixed on the green scrap of silk, now pinned neatly beside her magnifying glass. She had spent much of the night turning over possibilities, and by dawn a clear shape had begun to emerge from the mist of confusion. The scrap, the letters, Lydia's fear, all threads of a pattern someone had tried to weave out of sight, and Miss Marple, ever patient, had learned long ago that when something seemed neatly finished, one must always look at the back of the embroidery. That was where the knots truly lay. By 9 o'clock, she had made up her mind. She dressed warmly, slipped the silk into an envelope, and stepped into the street, where the puddles still shimmered from the night's rain. Her destination was the small cottage at the edge of the village, ivy-covered and meticulously tidy, belonging to Mrs. Edith Finch, the local seamstress. Mrs. Finch greeted her with brisk cheer when she opened the door. "Miss Marple, what a surprise. Do come in, mind the step. I was just putting the kettle on." The interior smelled of starch, soap, and lavender polish. On a table near the window lay several half-finished garments, a child's frock, a pair of trousers, and a silk scarf that caught Miss Marple's eye immediately. Its shade was identical to the scrap in her envelope. "Such a cozy place you have, Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple said mildly, settling herself on a straight-backed chair. "I don't suppose you still do much work for the late Mrs. Cooper, do you?" The woman's hands hesitated just slightly over her teacups before continuing. "Not much lately," she said, voice too casual. "Poor thing, she used to have me alter half her wardrobe, always fussing about the fit of things." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes, I remember her being particular. She had good taste, too. That green silk gown she wore at the vicar's tea last summer was quite striking." Mrs. Finch poured the tea. "Oh, yes, I made the alterations on that one myself." "I rather thought so," Miss Marple murmured, opening the envelope. She drew out the scrap of fabric and placed it on the table between them. "And perhaps you might recognize this, then." Mrs. Finch's eyes flickered, just for a second, but long enough. "Why, it looks like the same material. Was it torn?" Miss Marple's tone remained pleasant. "It was found near the pond the night of the murder. Odd, isn't it? The police assumed it came from Mrs. Cooper's dress. But I couldn't help noticing something peculiar." She pointed delicately to the faint black thread edging the fabric. "This stitch, you see, it isn't hers. Mrs. Cooper's hands were never steady enough for such fine work. But yours are, Mrs. Finch, quite unmistakably so. The woman's color drained. Miss Marple, I don't know what you mean. Oh, but you do, Miss Marple interrupted softly. You see, my dear, I believe that dress was altered twice. Once for fashion, and once for deception. You repaired it again after the murder, didn't you? To hide the tear left when you cut away this piece. Silence stretched between them like a drawn thread. Then Mrs. Finch gave a short, brittle laugh. You've a clever imagination, Miss Marple. Not clever, Miss Marple said. Just observant, the same way I noticed that you were the last to see Lydia alive, when you brought over her altered dress the afternoon before the tragedy. Mrs. Finch's hands trembled as she reached for her teacup. She was nervous that day, she said quietly, kept looking out the window as if expecting someone. And she told you something, didn't she? Miss Marple prompted gently. The seamstress's composure cracked. Her eyes filled with a bitter kind of fear. She told me she'd found the letters, that she knew who had written them. Said she was going to tell her husband that night. Miss Marple leaned forward. And you tried to stop her? Mrs. Finch gave a hollow laugh. Stop her? No. She didn't know I was the one writing them. Miss Marple said nothing, only folded her hands in her lap. Mrs. Finch went on, her voice brittle. It wasn't supposed to go that far. I just wanted her to suffer a little, for what she did to my sister. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Your sister? Beatrice Hall, Mrs. Finch said flatly. She was Harold Cooper's first fiancée. He jilted her for Lydia, said she was dull and too poor to suit his ambitions. Beatrice never recovered. She drowned herself 6 months later. Lydia never knew. I couldn't bear to let her be happy after that. The air between them was thick with sorrow. Miss Marple's voice was low, almost compassionate. So you frightened her with the letters. But something went wrong that night. Mrs. Finch stared into her cup. She found out it was me. She said she'd tell the police. I went there to beg her not to explain. But Harold came in, and he struck her. I saw it through the window. He turned his back, and I picked up the poker. I didn't think. I just acted. When he fell, I panicked. Lydia was unconscious, bleeding. I dragged her onto the rug, and I made it look as if she'd done it. She woke later, confused, terrified. I told her she must take the blame, that she'd killed him. She believed me. Miss Marple's gaze was sorrowful. You sewed her alibi and her doom with your own hands. Mrs. Finch pressed her palms to her face, weeping silently. I didn't mean for it to go so far. I know, Miss Marple said gently, but wickedness seldom announces itself. It creeps, stitch by stitch, until a tragedy is fully made. She rose quietly. I shall have to tell Inspector Graves. You understand that? Mrs. Finch nodded weakly, resignation settling upon her like dust. Outside, the rain began again. Soft, steady, cleansing. Miss Marple walked slowly through the village, her umbrella bobbing gently above her. When she reached the green, she paused to look toward the Cooper house. The windows were shuttered now, the garden overgrown, but in her mind's eye she saw Lydia, pale, bewildered, sitting alone before her fire, believing herself a murderer. Later that afternoon, Inspector Graves called at her cottage. She told him everything, quietly and thoroughly, leaving out none of the grim details. He listened, jaw tight, before nodding solemnly. When he left, Miss Marple lingered at the window, watching the clouds drift apart. The next morning brought an odd peace, not the fragile sort that hides secrets beneath silence, but the genuine calm that follows truth. The papers would call it a strange case of misplaced guilt, but St. Mary Mead would remember it as the affair of the widow who sewed her own alibi. That evening, Miss Marple sat once more by her fire, her knitting needles moving in steady rhythm. Outside, the village hummed with ordinary life. Laughter from the pub, a bicycle bell, the soft clatter of teacups next door. She smiled faintly. "It's always the quiet ones," she murmured, threading another row. And yet even in quietness, one must never mistake kindness for blindness. The fire crackled softly, and the little cottage glowed warm against the falling night. A small beacon of thought, memory, and unerring truth. For Miss Marple, it was simply another pattern completed, another human tapestry examined, thread by delicate thread, until the picture revealed itself at last. The following morning, St. Mary Mead seemed almost unnaturally bright, the sun gilding the rooftops and glinting off the damp cobblestones. Villagers bustled about, whispering with polite caution, aware now that even the quietest houses might conceal a story darker than they imagined. Miss Marple, however, moved through the streets with her usual serenity, a calm presence in the middle of rippling tension. She had spent the previous evening reflecting on Mrs. Finch's confession. It was one thing to know the truth. It was quite another to watch how its repercussions would ripple through the lives of those involved. Miss Marple's first call was to the Phelps household. Margaret had been staying with friends in the village since the events at Hillcrest, seeking distance from the household that had become so fraught with fear and secrecy. The moment she saw Miss Marple at the door, her shoulders slumped with relief. "Miss Marple," she said softly, ushering the detective inside. "I wasn't sure you would come." "I thought it best," Miss Marple replied, settling into an armchair. "I wanted to discuss a few things that may help put the past into perspective." Margaret wrung her hands. I keep thinking about Lydia. She's so alone now, though she didn't do what she thought she did. And yet," Miss Marple leaned forward, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Yes, my dear, that is the difficulty with human nature. We can believe ourselves guilty for actions that were never truly ours to claim. And the worst part is that we often carry that burden far longer than the one who caused the harm." Margaret nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "She told me she'd never recover. She keeps saying that even if she is freed someday, people will never trust her again." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Perhaps not, but we can take steps to ease her mind. One small kindness can be the thread that starts a new pattern in a troubled life." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a motor car approaching. Miss Marple excused herself, stepping outside. Inspector Graves had arrived, accompanied by 2 constables. His expression was tight, but controlled. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said. "I've brought a few things from Hillcrest that might interest you. Evidence we overlooked in the original investigation." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Motioning for him to continue, the inspector produced a small box containing letters, photographs, and the remaining fragments of the green silk dress. "I had these examined overnight. The thread you noted, black, fine, expertly sewn, matches a particular type of silk thread sold exclusively at Mrs. Finch's shop." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, that was my suspicion." "Furthermore," Graves continued, "we found additional correspondence between Mrs. Finch and an anonymous source who urged her to keep Lydia in the dark about the letters. Clearly, she did not act entirely on her own." Miss Marple's fingers traced the edge of the scrap of silk, turning it gently in the lamplight. "It is remarkable," she murmured, "how often one finds that an innocent-looking piece of cloth can contain the history of a crime. The most delicate stitches often hide the most pernicious designs." Graves frowned. So Lydia's fear was justified. She truly was being manipulated. "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. "But fear can be such a useful weapon. It encourages mistakes, makes the innocent suspect themselves, and convinces witnesses to fill in gaps that may never have existed." The inspector nodded slowly. "I suppose the question now is what to do with Mrs. Finch. Her confession was voluntary, but she still tried to cover the crime, indirectly framing Lydia." Miss Marple rose and moved to the window. Outside, the village lay bathed in early morning sun, the streets quiet save for a distant crow's call. "I believe, Inspector, that justice in this case is not solely the matter of punishment. Mrs. Finch's guilt must be acknowledged, yes, but it is also an opportunity for understanding, for showing the consequences of envy and secrecy, and for helping Lydia reclaim her life." Graves sighed. "A wise perspective, as always, but the law must take its course. I shall have to accompany Mrs. Finch to the station once the paperwork is complete." Miss Marple nodded. "I understand. But do not forget to speak gently to Lydia when you return. The mind can be as scarred as the body in times like these." After the inspector left, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. She settled into her favorite chair by the fire, the scrap of silk beside her. Her thoughts wandered through the entire chain of events. The letters, the green gown, Lydia's panic, and the meticulously hidden motives that had gone unnoticed by nearly everyone in the village. A faint knock at the door drew her attention. Margaret Phelps entered, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "I thought you might like this," she said softly, placing it on the table. Inside was a neatly bound book of letters, a collection of correspondence between Lydia and her friends, including Margaret herself. Miss Marple opened the book carefully, scanning the pages. "This," she murmured, "is a record of hope, proof that even when the pattern seems chaotic and the stitches appear wrong, there are always threads of kindness, connection, and truth woven throughout." Margaret sat quietly, watching Miss Marple turn the pages. "Do you think she'll ever be free in her mind?" Miss Marple looked up, eyes thoughtful. "Perhaps not entirely, but with patience, understanding, and the occasional gentle guidance, she may learn that the world is not only punishment, that even mistakes, the gravest ones, can be understood and sometimes forgiven." Outside, the wind stirred the leaves, sending golden flakes spiraling through the streets. Miss Marple closed the book and set it carefully on the table. She glanced toward the hearth, where the fire crackled warmly, casting shadows that danced like quiet witnesses to the events of the past week. "Yes," she murmured to herself, "the threads are unraveled, the truth revealed, and the tapestry laid bare. One can see every knot, every hidden stitch, every deception, and still there is room to mend, if only gently, with patience and understanding." Margaret stood. "Thank you, Miss Marple, for everything." "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied, offering her usual soft smile. "It is what we do for one another in small villages. Watch, listen, and sometimes guide those who cannot see the full picture themselves." Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening, and left the cottage. Miss Marple closed the door behind her and returned to her seat by the fire. The green scrap of silk gleamed faintly in the lamplight, a small testament to the hidden work of hands both innocent and guilty. She picked up her knitting once more, the rhythm of her needles filling the quiet room. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead lay still, unaware that beneath its serene surface the final truths had been uncovered, and the threads of deceit carefully, finally, unraveled. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, satisfied sigh. The case, as grim as it had been, was complete, and in that completion lay not only justice but understanding, the rarest stitch of all. By the following week, St. Mary Mead had settled into a semblance of normalcy. The village square once again buzzed with its usual activity. The baker's boy delivering fresh rolls, the postman waving to every passer-by, and the church bells marking the hours with familiar, comforting precision. Yet for those who had lived through the events at Hillcrest House, a faint tension lingered beneath the surface. Subtle as a shadow at the edge of sunlight, Miss Marple, as ever, carried on with her daily routines. She tended her garden in the mornings, trimmed the rose bushes with meticulous care, and moved quietly about her cottage, knitting in the soft glow of her lamp in the evenings. She often paused to gaze out of her window, her sharp eyes catching the minute details that escaped most villagers. The way a neighbor's dog nosed around the fence, the tilt of a shutter, or a fleeting expression passing across someone's face. She had received a brief letter from Inspector Graves, confirming that Mrs. Finch had been formally charged and would soon appear before the magistrate. Lydia Cooper, meanwhile, had been released on bail, her temporary exile from the village tempered by Margaret's constant presence and the kindness of a few trusted friends. As Miss Marple sat in her cottage one late afternoon, she reflected upon the curious layers of human nature that the case had revealed. It was remarkable, she thought, how fear, envy, and a sense of injustice could twist ordinary people into performing deeds so out of character, so carefully concealed, that even the sharpest observers might miss them. A knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Mrs. Bantry, her cheeks flushed with excitement and curiosity. "Jane, I simply must come in," she said breathlessly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I've been thinking about all this, about poor Lydia and that dreadful Mrs. Finch. It's so unsettling. I keep wondering if we ever really knew either of them." Miss Marple offered a small smile. "We know only what people allow us to see, Griselda, and sometimes even that is merely a careful performance." Mrs. Bantry settled into a chair, wringing her gloves nervously. "But Jane, how did you see through it all so effortlessly? The police seemed convinced that Lydia was the culprit, and yet you knew there was more." Miss Marple picked up her knitting, moving the needles in a measured rhythm. "It wasn't effortless, my dear. One observes, one listens, and one pays attention to the little things, the gestures, the inconsistencies, the minor details that everyone else overlooks. The world is full of clues if one has the patience to notice them." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "And the silk, Jane. That scrap of green silk. It was the key, wasn't it?" Miss Marple nodded, her hands never pausing in their work. "Indeed." A small, seemingly insignificant piece, but it revealed a hand at work that did not belong to the accused. The cleverest tricks are often the ones that hide in plain sight. Mrs. Bantry shook her head in astonishment. "You truly are remarkable, Jane. I can only hope I would have seen what you saw had I been in your place. Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "but it is not remarkable to notice what others fail to see. It is simply a matter of careful attention and an understanding of human nature, which, I assure you, is the same in St. Mary Mead as it is anywhere else." The conversation turned to lighter topics, and for a while, the cottage filled with the gentle hum of ordinary life. The ticking of the grandfather clock, the rustle of knitting, and Mrs. Bantry's soft chatter. Yet beneath the calm, Miss Marple's mind continued to review the events of the past weeks, ensuring every thread had been accounted for, every hidden stitch examined. Later, when Mrs. Bantry had left, Miss Marple returned to her window. The sun was setting behind the distant hills, casting the village in a warm, golden light. She observed the familiar figures moving through the streets, Mr. Price unloading groceries, children chasing a hoop along the cobblestones, and the postman delivering letters with cheerful diligence. Life, despite its occasional darkness, had resumed its rhythm. Her thoughts turned once more to Lydia. The woman had endured so much, caught between fear and misunderstanding, manipulated by envy and grief, yet she had survived. Miss Marple knew that true justice was not always found in courtrooms or through the law. Sometimes it existed in the recognition of truth, the correction of a misconception, and the gentle restoration of a frightened soul. The doorbell rang again, startling her. It was Margaret Phelps, carrying a small parcel of flowers. "I thought Lydia might like these," Margaret said, her voice quiet and hopeful. "She's resting today, but I wanted to bring a little color into her room." Miss Marple accepted the flowers, placing them in a vase on the windowsill. "A thoughtful gesture," she said. "Kindness, my dear, is often the most effective balm for a troubled heart." Margaret smiled faintly, a hint of relief in her eyes. "Thank you, Miss Marple, for everything, for seeing the truth and for helping Lydia. I don't know how she would have managed without you." Miss Marple inclined her head. "It is what one does when one cares for one's neighbors, my dear. And in a small village, caring often means looking beyond the surface, listening to the unspoken and understanding the hidden motives that guide people's actions." When Margaret had left, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire. The scraps of silk, the letters, the careful stitching of both garments and alibis, all lay neatly organized before her, a testament to the resolution of the mystery. Yet as she worked her needles in quiet rhythm, she knew that human nature would always provide new puzzles, new threads to examine, and new truths to uncover. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead slept beneath the soft light of the moon. The events of Hillcrest House had passed into memory, leaving behind lessons in fear, envy, courage, and compassion. Miss Marple, serene and ever watchful, allowed herself a faint, satisfied smile. The tapestry of human behavior, with all its twists and hidden stitches, had been revealed once more, and in the gentle quiet of her cottage, the world seemed to hold its breath, knowing that for now, the balance of justice and understanding had been restored, all through the steady, observant hand of Miss Jane Marple. With Mrs. Finch in custody, and Lydia Cooper gradually reclaiming her sense of self, St. Mary Mead slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. The market stalls bustled, children played along the village lanes, and the church bells chimed the hours without interruption. On the surface, everything appeared calm, yet Miss Marple knew that the quiet of a village often concealed more than it revealed. She sat by her window in the late afternoon, her knitting resting in her lap, her gaze drifting across the familiar rooftops. The sunlight caught the leaves of the village trees, turning them to gold, and the distant hills seemed at peace. Yet, as always, she reflected on the subtle undercurrents of human nature, the envy, fear, and secrets that could transform ordinary people into actors in extraordinary tragedies. The case of Lydia Cooper had been a reminder that guilt is sometimes assumed by the innocent, while the truly culpable hide behind appearances and careful manipulation. A scrap of silk, a minor letter, a single thread. Such small details often hold the key to truth, and it is in noticing them, in observing human behavior with patience and care, that justice and understanding can be restored. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, contented smile. She had untangled the web of deceit, restored balance to the lives affected, and, in her gentle way, offered the villagers a quiet lesson in compassion and vigilance. Human nature, she mused, could be both fragile and resilient, cruel and kind, and it was her lifelong fascination to observe its patterns and hidden stitches as the sun dipped below the horizon and the village settled into twilight. Miss Marple picked up her needles once more. Outside, St. Mary Mead slept peacefully. The events of Hillcrest House now a chapter in its long and intricate story. Yet Miss Marple knew that the tapestry of life, with all its secrets, betrayals, and quiet heroics, would continue to unfold, and she would be there, quietly watching, patiently observing, and gently guiding, stitch by subtle stitch. In the end, the village returned to its routine, but with a deeper understanding that appearances could deceive, that courage and fear coexist, and that even the smallest gestures, a flower, a kind word, a careful observation, can mend hearts and reveal truths hidden beneath the calm. For Miss Marple, it was simply another day's work, another web of human behavior examined, another mystery resolved, and another quiet testament to the enduring power of patience, perception, and understanding.